and they bring in St. John Paul II, and they're going to make him a saint these days, but they should give him his name, the Saint of the Rapists, because he was the protector of all the rapists worldwide. Thousands of people venerated John Paul II, the one who knew how to love everyone equally, caring for the most needy, visiting the lands of the poorest, spreading his faith and love for others. These and many other things made him worthy of becoming a saint in the Catholic religion. However, there's always a but. There were other people who didn't see it that way. Many believed that behind that compassionate look he showed to his followers, a perverse darkness was hidden. And it turned out that John Paul II was hiding something more, or rather protecting some very dangerous people. Promising accusations came to light against him after his death, and one of them was the case of Emanuela Orlandi, also known as the Vatican Girl, a mystery that remains unsolved 40 years after her disappearance, and her family is convinced that the Vatican knows things it refuses to reveal in order not to create a scandal that would harm the Holy See. Lies, rumors, and dark secrets surround a pope who apparently was not as good as believed. But what was Pope John Paul II hiding? Did he have anything to do with the disappearance of Emanuela? I'll discuss this in the video.
Emanuela Orlandi was the daughter of Ercole Orlandi, an employee of the Apostolic Palace.
She also lived with her mother, Maria Pezzano, and her siblings Natalia, Pietro, Federica, and Cristina in a house within the boundaries of Vatican City. Emanuela was a girl like any other. She had a group of friends, loved music, and was very good at studies, but her normal life, like that of any teenager, would change when, on Wednesday, June 22, 1983, she disappeared without a trace. That day, Emanuela left her house around 4:30 in the afternoon, as every Wednesday, when she attended her flute, piano, choral singing, and solfeggio classes at the Tommaso Ludovico da Vittoria Institute in Santo Apollinare Square. After finishing one of the classes, she called her sister Federica and told her about an offer she had just received to distribute leaflets for a Bon Cosmetics salesman. Emanuela said that this man had promised her money and that she would see this person again at the end of the last class to tell him whether she accepted the offer or not. Federica had a bad feeling about it at that moment, especially because the payment seemed exaggerated for such a simple job, 375,000 liras, and about $450,000. So she told her younger sister not to accept and to come home after her studies. But the young woman never returned. Emanuela left school with her classmates, to whom she told about the job offer. She was uncertain about taking it. At 7:20 in the evening, they said goodbye and her friends got on the bus. At that moment, Emanuela was left alone on Corso del Rinascimento in front of the Palazzo Madama. The young woman had made a decision that she didn't share with anyone, and her sister Cristina was waiting for her until 7:30 when she decided to go to the school herself, but she didn't find her. She returned home an hour later, believing that they had missed each other on the way and that her sister would have already arrived home safe and sound, but to her bewilderment, Emanuela was not there either. She quickly alerted her parents who, without wasting any more time, began their search throughout the city. However, they could not find her. The father went to the police station to report his daughter's disappearance, but the officers didn't take it very seriously because not much time had passed, and besides, it was a Vatican City, not Italian. The family then had to wait several agonizing hours until the next morning they were finally able to file a missing person report at the Vatican police station. It was there that they came across the first clue. A traffic guard and a police officer had seen the previous day a young girl with a name carrying a fertilizer advertising bag, and who were next to an old green Bayerische Motorenwerke. On Saturday, June 25th, the family then received a phone call from a boy who said he was 16 years old and named Pierluigi, who said that he and his girlfriend had seen a girl who looked like Emanuela in Campo de Fiori while she was selling fertilizer products. According to him, this girl said her name was Barbara, and she had a flute but didn't want to play it in front of everyone since she would have to wear glasses to read the sheet music. Everything seemed to indicate that it was Manuela, except for the name Barbara, which could have been false. It seemed like they were on the right track, but things weren't going to be that easy. at the end of June in 1983. Rome was covered in posters of a missing girl, 15-year-old brunette with long hair, but no one paid much attention. It was just another disappearance. Days later, on June 27th, a man named Mario called the family and claimed to own a bar near Ponte Vittorio, between the Vatican and the School of Music. He reported that he saw a young woman named Barbara who had confessed to him that she had run away but would return home for her sister's wedding. This information turned out to be true, as Natalina Orlandi, Manuela's older sister, was getting married in September. When asked about the girl's height, a second male voice was heard in the background saying no more, and then the call ended, leaving the family once again in a dead end. Of the many calls the Orlandi received, those from Pierluigi and Mario were considered reliable, although neither had explicitly mentioned Emanuela, but had called her Barbara. Both were clearly talking about her. What at first had been concrete evidence that seemed to lead them to Manuela's whereabouts, over the years this idea crumbled, giving rise to the hypothesis that both calls were a diversion to allow the real culprits to buy time and dispose of the young girl without raising suspicions. Decades passed without knowing anything more about Manuela. The investigations led the detectives to doubt the hypotheses that it had been a forced kidnapping, because the girl was last seen on Corso Rinascimento, one of the busiest streets in Rome, in broad daylight, so it was not realistic that they had taken her by force without anyone noticing. This led the investigators to conclude that whoever had taken the young girl could have been someone she knew and trusted. Although thousands of clues and edges crossed the investigations, like the possible guilt of the Italian mafia or terrorists who could never provide any real proof of her captivity, there was a theory that seemed possible and that implicated people from the Vatican and none other than Pope John Paul II himself. According to a cardinal of the church who communicated with Emanuela's brother, in the days following her disappearance, he heard a conversation between two Vatican gendarmes who said they had seen the young girl return to the Vatican the same night of her disappearance in a luxury car.
Apparently, Emanuela left the gates of the Vatican 20 minutes later, got back in the car, and left.
The two gendarmes couldn't see who the car's driver was, but they got the impression that he had parked a few meters away to avoid being recognized. The cardinal never gave any further explanations about this rumor, and the identity of the two gendarmes remained unknown. Thus, in the early 2000s, 20 years after his disappearance, the Italian journalist Pino Nicotri rejected the hypothesis of the kidnapping by terrorists, which, according to him, was only to divert attention, and that the hypotheses of the Italian mafia had been invented by the media. Nicotri claimed, thanks to a source within the Vatican, that Manuela accidentally died the same night of her disappearance during a meeting with high-ranking figures of the Vatican in an apartment on Via Monte del Gallo near the Vatican. In 2012, nearly 30 years after her disappearance, the Vatican's exorcist, Gabriel Amor, indeed published a book where he claimed that parties were organized in which a gendarme of the Holy See was involved as a recruiter of girls and believed that Manuela was a victim of this. The exorcist was certain that Manuela's kidnapping was a case of sexual exploitation that ended in homicide shortly after the disappearance and concealment of the body by religious people. In 2016, one of Manuela's best friends indeed revealed that a few months before the disappearance, the young woman confessed to her that she was strongly harassed by someone close to the Pope while she was in the Vatican gardens. All these testimonies seem to indicate that high-ranking members of the Catholic religion were involved in Manuela's case. But what about Pope John Paul II? At the time of her disappearance, he was already the Supreme Pontiff. It turned out that the Pope had spoken publicly about the case on July 3rd, a month after the disappearance he made, the first of many public mentions of the young woman, and the possibility of a deprivation of liberty arose. He then met twice with the Orlandi family on July 7th and visited them on December 24th, when he told the family that Manuela's case was a matter of international terrorism. Over time, this idea was discarded, And just when the Vatican, in a historic turn, decided in 2023 to open an investigation to somehow clarify what happened after decades of back and forth, false leads, and many other strange things. Pietro Orlandi, Emanuela's brother, who had been demanding justice for years, shocked everyone by raising suspicions of an alleged pedophile lead that involved none other than John Paul II.
During a TV show, Pietro hinted that John Paul II and some bishops would leave the Vatican at night to seek out young people in Rome.
I'm convinced that John Paul II, Ratzinger, and Pope Francis are aware. They tell me that John Paul II, certain time, at night he would go out with two monsignors, Poles, and surely he wasn't going to bless houses. In turn, on the Italian television program, there was also audio of a phone call in which a former member of the criminal gang from the Roman neighborhood of Magliana implicated the Pope in what would have been sexual parties with minors. More than 30 years after the disappearance, hundreds of false leads, and the possible cover-up by the Church and the Pope himself. The family evidently felt an inexplicable pain from being deceived so many times by those who had shown their support for the cause. So the question here is, a pope loved by all, turned into a saint and now accused of being a lover of the little ones.
How could this happen? Was it unforeseen or deliberately ignored?
How did he come to power and who had he protected all this time? Well, the truth would leave everyone horrified. On October 16th, 1978, the whole world watched on television the surprising death of John Paul II after 33 days of papacy and the historic chimney with white smoke indicating the election of a new pope for the Catholic Church. Thus, Karol Joseph Wojtyla became John Paul II, the first pontiff who was not of Italian origin. Wojtyla is said to be the most beloved and popular pope in history. He knew how to win the affection of the crowds, so as soon as he arrived in any country, the first thing he did was roll up his cassock and kiss the ground. John Paul II was the Messiah who came to profess his faith, supposedly to save all sinners. The people's devotion to this pope was inevitable all over the world. A humble and martyr man who, after being persecuted by the blacks, achieved the dream of being one of the most important figures in the world. But not everything was as it seemed. His fight for world peace was not for all countries, because it turned out that the Pope sympathized with the dictatorial policies of Augusto Pinochet, maintaining a friendly relationship with that dictator. The Pope, moreover, never raised his voice for the river of blood that bathed Chile. He also maintained a close friendship with Kurt Waldheim, President of Austria, and who was a Nazi officer who served the Third Reich in World War II. But there was something even worse. The Pope rejected the use of condoms. After 3 years of coming to power, when the first cases of human immunodeficiency virus were detected, he did not change his opinion, not even knowing that every day 12,000 Africans contracted the virus in the 80s. His rejection of this contraceptive contributed to the spread of this disease. In addition, he did not hesitate to exclaim that homosexuality was a sin and forbade women from making decisions about their own bodies. Sex outside of marriage, women in important ecclesiastical positions, and masturbation were actions repudiated by the Supreme Pontiff. It seemed that this man, or rather the spokesperson of God on earth, was completely opposed to any kind of sexual relationship outside of marriage between a man and a woman. But apparently the most shameful thing is that this was only a hypocritical facade, because the beloved Pope seemed to be in favor of relationships involving innocent children at the hands of his religious colleagues. A research document prepared by a Polish television channel provided documents and testimonies that pointed to the fact that John Paul II knew about and concealed cases of intimate abuse of minors within the Catholic Church in his country.
John Paul's tendency was not to correct the situation, but to keep it secret and confidential until he could no longer control it.
The Boston case, for example, of Cardinal Bernalo was accused of protecting 87 priests who abused more than 500 children. He knew perfectly well and made him rector of the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. In this investigation, 3 priests were accused, whom Karol, then Archbishop of Krakow, transferred and protected in the 1970s when he became aware of the accusations against them. One of them was Father Eugenius Sergen, who was guilty of intimate assaults on minors in at least 5 different parishes and who was directly reported to John Paul II by several people. Another of the accused was Father Sadus, who, after working as a catechism instructor in direct contact with children, accumulated a large number of complaints for sexual assaults on minors and was finally sent to a lucrative job in an Austrian parish through the direct intercession of John Paul II. In addition, who was John Paul II's mentor in his early years, Cardinal Zapiega, forced seminarians to carry out intimate practices that also included violent acts. On the other hand, Archbishop Rember Wickland claimed that John Paul II confessed to him that he knew about Zapiega's behavior and confessed that he did not know what to do, and according to Wickland, he broke down. Thus, during the time he served as Cardinal Karol or John Paul II, he also became aware of accusations against other priests under his authority and sometimes received this information directly from the victims, who sought his help from parishes throughout the region in the hope that he could do something about it. But to the victims' dismay, in all these cases, John Paul II first insisted on confirming the truth of the facts and then promised to take action. But what do you think? He never made any complaints or imposed any punishment against the guilty. In fact, a former student of John Paul II stated in a report that perhaps Karol had become accustomed to such things happening in the church and therefore chose to hide them. But there was one case that stood out from all of them, and for many, John Paul II protected him despite all the evidence against him. It was the case, as I was telling you, of the Mexican priest Marcial Maciel, accused of multiple abuses. It all started on January 3rd, 1941, when a 21-year-old Mexican seminarian created a religious organization that became, in the words of John Paul II, a guide for youth. However, behind that missionary facade, a hell was operating in which the founder and many of his followers abused hundreds of minors. Maciel had become the greatest intimate abuser in the modern history of the church, a demon.
But the criminal was not satisfied with his own practices that had led him to intimately abuse more than 60 minors, but also instilled his sick actions in his disciples.
In addition to the abuses perpetrated by this scoundrel between 1941 and until 2008, when luckily he lost his life naturally as well, there were a total of 175 minors between the ages of 11 and 16 victims of 33 priests from his congregation. Another 90 students from the schools and seminaries dependent on the organization were abused by 54 seminarians. These numbers were just the tip of the iceberg, a minimal part of the crimes committed to hide a larger scandal and thus save the organization, which was also a cover for money laundering maneuvers of almost $300 million. The arrival of the Pole Carol to the leadership of the church meant a new push for Maciel and his Legionaries of Christ. John Paul II took him under his wing and appeared with him on the trips he made to Mexico in the year 79. John Paul II took him under his wing and appeared with him on the trips he made to Mexico in the years 79, 1990, and 1993, and 1993. He also entrusted him with missions in Europe and Latin America and appointed him a permanent consultant to the Congregation for the Clergy in 1994 and a member of the Special Assembly for America of the Synod of Bishops in 1997. Later, when on November 26, 1994, Maciel celebrated 50 years as a priest, the Pope sent him a congratulatory letter for his pastoral work. 3 years earlier, on the 50th anniversary of the existence of the Legionaries of Christ, the Pontiff himself ordained 60 new priests of the congregation in St. Peter's Basilica. Even with hundreds of allegations of intimate abuse against Maciel and the Legionaries, the Pope did not hesitate to continue keeping the abuser under his protective wing. For him, Maciel was an effective guide for the youth, or I would say, this is already my opinion, a way to receive a lot of money. The church could not claim ignorance to the allegations of abuse against Maciel. The founder of the Legionaries of Christ had been investigated between October 1956 and February 1959, almost half a century after that investigation. So Maciel was suspended for a few months, but then, reinstated in his duties, he continued with impunity. It made him rector of the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. So that means that for them, the harm done to children sexually abused by these people with depraved behaviors is not relevant, but that it is not known, that it does not affect. Every time the victims tried to get their attackers punished, the Church's response was always not to prosecute a friend of the Pope. Finally, it took the death of John Paul II to change the fate of the founder of the Legionaries. Benedict XVI ordered him to retire from public priesthood to devote himself to a life of prayer and penance, a way to erase him from the map to silence criticism instead of putting him in jail. The protection of 3 popes, and especially that of John Paul II during his extensive papacy, had kept him safe, allowing him to die in peace without having to face justice for his perverse acts. But if divine justice exists, I hope it is carried out after death.
This was the last time John Paul II appeared in St. Peter's Square.
It was Wednesday, March 30th, 2005.
John Paul couldn't speak. He was very weak. He had undergone a tracheotomy 2 months earlier. Later, he suffered 2 major infections. The pontificate of St. John Paul II was the 3rd longest in the over 2,000 years of history of the Catholic Church, as he remained in the chair of St. Peter for 26 years and 5 months until he lost his life on April 2nd, 2005 at 9:37 in the evening on the eve of Divine Mercy Sunday, a feast established during his pontificate. May our prayerful silence accompany these first moments of the meeting of Holy Father John Paul II with Christ in heaven. During his last week of life, he received processed food through a nasal tube. Doctors pointed out that the problems with food intake and breathing of the 84-year-old Pope were a consequence of Parkinson's disease. 75 heads of state attended his funeral, including presidents, princes, among other authorities. The population of Rome doubled during that event. When St. Peter's Square was at its full capacity, everything fell completely silent. The next morning, the remains were displayed in the Apostolic Palace for the people of the Roman Curia to approach. A day later, they were moved to St. Peter's, where hundreds of thousands of pilgrims came to thank him and say goodbye. At the end of the Mass, hundreds of people asked for what everyone wanted, that he be declared a saint as soon as possible. As the years went by, the legacy of the Polish Pope came under scrutiny, and many wondered if declaring him a saint in 2014 was a good idea. I don't think so. Being proclaimed a saint is a worthy recognition for a person who lived and died in such an exemplary way that they deserve public veneration through the Church. But this person meets the requirements. I don't think so. You tell me in the comments. How is it possible that a man who claims to be holy at the same time was a man who was head of state and responsible for the Catholic Church, that maintained this systematic policy of cover-up during his pontificate, and that harmed thousands of girls and boys around the world? John Paul II weakened faith in the Church, and that's true. He broke its credibility as an institution and set a deplorable example for bishops by ignoring the stories of abuse victims, giving many the freedom to lash out against the most vulnerable, knowing there would be no punishment. Thanks to this individual and others alike, many have lost faith in God, and even more so in the Church. This is undeniable. The dark secrets of the most beloved Pope do not compare to the secrets of the highest institution, the Church. Sexism, contempt for women, dirty dealings with politicians and big businessmen, and above all, child abuse are some of the uncomfortable events that the Church does not want to accept. The Church has apologized to the victims in various ways, but the lack of decisive action by John Paul II since the scandals began in the 90s has been a source of criticism. John Paul II's support for Marcial Maciel, among many other religious figures, and the concealment of Emanuela Orlandi's whereabouts do not make him worthy of being a saint. Emanuela's remains were never found, and nothing more was ever known about her. Since then, she is the only missing person in the history of the Vatican whom her family has been tirelessly searching for 41 years. They still hope that the church will finally reveal what happened that fateful day, but I don't think this will happen soon. Thus, after so many years of silence and concealment, it's time for a reckoning on the part of Catholicism that has left so many cases unpunished in its thousands of years of history. If they want to do things right, it's time for them to tell the truth. Thank you.